Hello everybody, and today you're watching yet another update from Force 13 on all the Atlantic tropical activity that is going on right now. And there's a lot. We have Hurricane Irma, the biggest storm and poses the biggest threat to land. Hurricane Jose, that is posing threat to the Leeward Islands, and Hurricane Katia, which is posing a threat to Mexico. So here's a satellite loop of all three storms, all three hurricanes. Uh, Irma, Jose, and Katia. All three hurricanes, Irma and Jose, are both Category 4s. This is the first time this has happened since 2010, and it's the first time that we have ever had two storms 150 miles an hour or greater in the Atlantic, period. But before we get to Irma and Jose, Irma in particular, let's take a look at Katia. This storm is currently a Category 2 hurricane, which is moving southwestward towards Mexico and should make landfall there within the next 6 hours, maybe a little bit more than that. It did show an apparent eye earlier today. That since has been clouded over, but regardless of its strength, it's still likely to bring some very heavy rains to the mountainous areas of Mexico, along with some very high winds and some storm surge for the parts north of where it makes landfall. This is the current National Hurricane Center forecast track, taking it into Mexico by 1 a.m. Central Daylight Time, Mexican time, basically, Central Time, and then moving it inland and then dissipating it by tomorrow afternoon. Hurricane warnings in effect for the coastline, and tropical storm warnings in effect for the areas surrounding that. We also have Hurricane Jose, which rapidly intensified into a very powerful Category 4 hurricane today. It appears to be losing some strength, just looking at satellite imagery alone, but regardless, it's still a very powerful and dangerous hurricane, and should be moving right towards the Leeward Islands, which unfortunately were the same islands that just took a direct hit from Hurricane Irma when it was a very powerful Category 5. And this storm may not pass over the islands, but it certainly get very close. But even if it doesn't pass over, they're still likely to get adverse effects from it. This is the current National Hurricane Center forecast track, showing that there are hurricane warnings in effect for Antigua, Barbuda, and some of the other Leeward Islands, as well as some tropical storm watches and warnings in effect, as Jose is probably going to brush these islands just to the northeast, but still bring some very dangerous conditions to those islands, and it makes matters worse if it actually moves over those islands as a Category 4 hurricane, which it is currently forecast to do. After that is forecast to move out into the open Atlantic and just kind of meander south and southwest of Bermuda. So that's Jose. Now for the main attraction, which is Hurricane Irma, this very powerful Category 4 hurricanes, now 4 down from a Category 5 that an intensity it maintained for a remarkably long time. Currently moving just north of Cuba, and in the last few frames it looks to be taking a little bit more of a westward jog. That might just be a trick of the imagery, but that's just what I'm observing right now. And it is very possible that the storm could actually make a landfall in Cuba, but regardless of the landfall, the impacts are still likely to be severe, and they're already occurring, because as we look at the current radar imagery out of Camagüey province in Cuba, we can see a very well-defined singular eye wall. That's a difference from earlier today, and some adverse conditions coming in from the spiral bands associated with Hurricane Irma. So very high winds, flooding rains, and some storm surge for the areas to the west of the eye for Cuba are likely, if not already imminent, which they already are. Recon is currently out there investigating Irma, and they found a pressure of 925 millibars. This graphic, by the way, courtesy of Tropical Tidbits, and they're currently going to fly into the eye again to get another reading. They did find some Category 5 winds at the flight level, which equates to Category 4 winds at the surface. And the surface winds is what matters. And this pressure is down a little bit from earlier today, from the dropsons from earlier today, I noticed. So that is an unwelcome trend, to say the least. And that's what's currently happening. As we all know, probably as we heard in the news, this storm is forecast to take a turn to the north and eventually impact Florida. We can take a look at that by looking at the National Hurricane Center forecast graphic. There's been a trend today with the cone, and that is that it's no longer expected to be a central and east coast landfall. It's now expected to be a Keys landfall and the west coast of Florida that gets a hit. So that is a change that is not good news for the folks living on the west coast. It's good news for those living on the east coast of Florida, even though they still will get adverse conditions from the storm. Another trend that we have seen today is a little bit further south than the forecast track in the next 24 hours, meaning that a landfall in Cuba cannot be ruled out. And that would just make matters worse for them, and it wouldn't really help the situation for Florida, because yes, it would lose some intensity. It would lose some intensity if it moves over Cuba, but not a lot, because it would just be scraping the coast, and once it gets back into the Florida Straits, it's going to have plenty of energy to work with to re-strengthen back into what it originally was, maybe even stronger, because if we take a look at sea surface temperatures, they are very high, 29, 30 degrees Celsius, which is around or just under 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and that is just hot tub water, basically, for this storm to work with, and that is certainly not good for everybody in its path. And remember, it's not just Cuba and Florida, it's also the Bahamas that are already getting an impact. Hurricane warnings up for all of the Bahamas except for the Turks and Caicos. Hurricane warnings also up for the northern coast of Cuba, and the central northern coast, to be more specific. And hurricane warnings also in effect from basically Tampa to Melbourne south. So that's basically where the hurricane warnings are in effect. Also for Lake Okeechobee for those for the areas around there. Hurricane watches also extend farther north, probably from what I would see as Cedar Key to Daytona Beach south to the hurricane warning area. Hurricane watches are also in effect for the entire eastern coast of Cuba, and the area just to the west of the hurricane warning area, and that might be upgraded to a hurricane warning soon as well. And tropical storm warnings are in effect for the same areas that a hurricane watch is in effect for in the eastern parts of Cuba. So that's just basically a quick rundown of the warnings, no specifics, but if you want a geographical key, then there's a map up here for you right now. And after this, and just to put a little note out there, the NHC is expecting the storm to re-strengthen into a Category 5 hurricane and to make landfall in the Keys, possibly as a Category 5 hurricane. If that were to happen, it would be the first Category 5 landfall in the United States since Hurricane Andrew of 1992, and the most recent in the Keys since 1935, when the Labor Day hurricane came through that area. But regardless of these stats, this is a huge storm. It's a major problem for this area of the country. And it's not just Florida. It's also Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Carolinas, and even Mississippi, as the storm is expected to move up there as a weakened storm, not a hurricane, but still a pretty powerful system, tropical or not. It'll still bring some very heavy rains up to this area. In fact, let me just pull this up. We can see that we have areas of 20 inches of rain forecast in between Florida and Cuba, and some areas of Florida could see as much as 15 inches of rain, possibly even isolated areas of more. 10 inches of rain, probably a foot of rain extending up the entire peninsula, especially to the right of where Irma's center is supposed to go. We'll get into that in a minute. And even rain farther up north, as I said earlier, from Irma. It's not just the inland flooding that we're worried about. It's also coastal flooding, obviously, as you guys have been hearing. Storm surge is a huge issue with this storm. As we can see, there are storm surge warnings in effect from pretty much Palm Bay all the way, not specifically, but just south of Palm Bay all the way down to the Keys and up north to the Port Charlotte area and even a bit farther past then. This is a new product from the National Hurricane Center, and this basically details where storm surge is likely to be the highest, because in some of these areas, storm surge could be as high as 12 feet, maybe even a bit more than that, especially for some of these areas along the west coast. As the storm travels up the coast, you're probably going to get backwind. It's not going to be like, say, Matthew from last year, moved up the coast, and all the surge was focused to the north of it. This time will be the south of it, because of just the way the storm orients and the way that the coastline is shaped. So definitely not good news for the west coast. The east coast, you will still get impacts regardless of where the storm tracks. And speaking of where the storm tracks, let's take a quick look at the steering currents, just briefly for Irma. I have this model run up here from Tropical Tidbits displaying this whole thing. So that'll just help assist me here. And we have, okay, that works. So we have this deep layer trough that's moving out of the Ohio River Valley. And we have this ridge that is stronger than is forecast. That's why the model shifted west, because this is stronger than forecast. This is not the scale, by the way. So this is what's pushing Irma towards the to the west-northwest. And we also have, if we go out in time a little bit more, we can see that there is a shortwave trough that is coming out of this general area and will be moving southeast into the area around the central Gulf Coast, and that will be oriented around here, so like that, and be pulling air north. And with this ridge out to Irma's east, pushing air north as well, that provides a path for the storm to just move up the west coast of Florida. And when this as this trough kicks out right here, we're going to have the storm be able to take a path not just straight north, but then kind of bend a little bit, as we saw in the NHC forecast. And that will be constituted mostly by the ridge kicking out, and this other ridge over the Rockies, they'll be pushing south into Texas, the one that's actually already there, excuse that, and is currently over Texas, and that is, by the way, what is steering Katia to the southwest. And what that's going to do is it could help pull the storm a little bit further south, but this is also quite long range, and the storm will be post-tropical by then. Not saying it will be less of an impact, but it will probably not be as big of an impact as it was earlier per se. So that's just a quick synoptic rundown of why Irma is moving out. There's some other blocking stuff going up in the northern plains and all that stuff that was that's going on right now. I won't get into too much detail into that because that's not what we're really focused on right now. So this is Irma right now, moving in this general direction, likely to skirt, just to recap all this, to skirt the north coast of Cuba, move up into the Keys, skirt the west coast of Florida, and then up the peninsula, potentially making a landfall somewhere along the coast. But the landfall does not matter, as the storm's impacts, if we're just going to take a look at this really quick, the storm's impacts are going to be felt all throughout the peninsula, regardless of where landfall is. We're going to see rain from. Remember that hurricanes tend to be weighted more towards the east of the center, so that means even if the storm skirts off, just offshore of the west coast of Florida, we're still going to see impacts all up and down the peninsula due to the way the storm is oriented. And we're going to have the potential for heavy rain, isolated tornadoes in some areas, storm surge as much as potentially as high as 14 feet, if I were to imagine, and even storm surge along the east coast of Florida. I just want to mention this really quickly, because if the storm's moving up this way, okay, we have surge coming in this way, but we also have air being piled in this way, so there's still going to be surge along the east coast of Florida, maybe on the scale of Matthew of last year, to just give a quick comparison. So that's basically the surge rundown, and even right now, if the storm continues moving in this general direction, we actually might, and the storm is actually kind of around here, per se, we actually could be seeing surge coming in from the north for the Keys. So that is another thing that we might need to be paying attention to as well, is that really, no matter how you slice it, the storm is going to be significant in pretty much any regard. It doesn't matter, even if it takes a track kind of like this, it will still be significant. But the general idea is that this is a very dangerous storm. If you have not finished your preparations, you need to have already done so. And if you are evacuating, then you need to hurry up if you can, because the storm is moving in quick. And I know the geographical situation isn't the best in Florida for evacuations because of just the way it's laid out, as all these people have to travel up the peninsula in order to get out, and you can't really even travel to Key West even because of the geographic layout. So that's basically the rundown for Hurricane Irma, and stay tuned for more updates from Force 13, and for those of you in the storm's path, please stay safe and expect more updates.
You can follow Force 13's outlets, the website force13.co.uk, at your service at any time. You can also find us on YouTube, the channel, search Force 13, all in text, and subscribe if you haven't already. You can also find us on Facebook at Force 13, and it's at Force 13 on Twitter, that's the handle to contact us there. You can also add Fool13 on Skype, that's FOOL13, and add extension 9094 on Discord for tropical weather chat.